instantly claiming central territory. This establishes a strong pawn presence that dictates early positional ambitions. Establishing central control. Black mirrors white's ambition, setting the stage for a solid, symmetrical pawn structure. Developing the knight prepares for queenside castling and reinforces central control. Immediately contesting the center. This pawn thrust creates sharp imbalances and opens the door to active counterplay. Sharpening central pressure. White immediately contests the d5 pawn and aims for a space advantage. Accepting the central pawn sacrifice opens up vital diagonal influence for black's queen and bishops. Sacrificing pawn control for an open d-file. Aiming to disrupt black's pawn structure and launch an early central assault. Reclaiming the pawn immediately resolves the central tension and prepares for a more open, dynamic middle game where piece activity will be paramount. Securing central influence with the knight solidifies white's queenside ambitions. Developing the knight to c6 solidifies the pawn structure and prepares for nf6. Bringing the queenside into the strategic battle. Developing the bishop to this active diagonal immediately pressures black's d5 pawn, creating imbalances. Developing the knight to f6 reinforces the central pawn structure and prepares for castling, offering a sound and natural continuation. Solidifying the center's pawns, white prepares to develop the bishop on the kingside. Black seeks to cramp white's queenside pawns by extending the central pawns, creating a complex pawn structure. Securing the bishop's diagonal enhances piece coordination and prepares for pawn breaks. Developing the bishop to b4 now pins the knight, creating tactical possibilities and aiming to disrupt white's central pawn structure. Securing the monarch is paramount. This king's relocation shores up kingside defenses and prepares for active piece play. Exchanging the bishop for the knight simplifies the position, potentially opening lines for black's pieces. Opening the b-file after black's capture creates attacking opportunities, but sacrifices pawn structure solidity. Unleashing a knight to e4 seizes central control and challenges the bishop's influence. Unleashing the queen. White prepares to exploit the advanced pawn on c4 and potentially open lines towards black's king. Unleashing the kingside pawn storm. Black seeks to seize the initiative and create attacking opportunities, though it might leave the king exposed. Relocating the knight to d2 strategically prepares its redeployment to f3. Aiming to challenge black's dominant central pawn structure and gain central control. Safeguarding the monarch secures the position, preparing for queenside expansion and potential counterplay. Flipping open the king's diagonal. This pawn push promises immediate tactical fireworks by exposing weaknesses. Exchanging the knight liberates the c-file and targets white's doubled pawns. A significant positional concession. Unlocking the queen's diagonal offers attacking potential, but leaves the kingside a tad exposed. Developing the bishop to e6 shores up the central pawn structure and prepares to contest the d-file, aiming for a more balanced pawn formation. A strategic repositioning, aiming to exploit the open b-file and potentially challenge black's queenside pawn structure. Securing the queenside pawn chain while passively ceding space. This aims to solidify black's central foothold. Developing the rook to the d-file shores up the central pawn structure and prepares for potential action against black's queenside pawns. Seeking a knight outpost on e7. Black aims to reposition this piece defensively or prepare for a central break, potentially influencing the d5 pawn. Probing the queenside. This pawn push aims to gain space and disrupt black's coordination, potentially creating weaknesses on the b-file. Averting isolation, black mobilizes the queen to a more active, less exposed post. Opening the queenside file initiates a direct assault on black's pawn structure. Pushing this pawn breaks white's queenside pawn structure, aiming to open lines for black's pieces. Asserting queenside space. This pawn thrust aims to disrupt black's development and potentially open lines for attacking white's monarch. Targeting the queen to create space and disrupt white's pawn structure. This maneuver seeks to liberate black's pieces from their cramped quarters. Focusing the queen on the queenside creates immediate pressure on black's pawn structure, potentially opening lines for a later attack. This development solidifies the bishop's influence on the queenside diagonal, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure. Targeting the queenside weakness, this aims to pry open lines and exploit the isolated pawn. Reclaiming central influence. The knight ventures toward greener pastures, initiating a potential kingside dance. Inviting doubled pawns on the queenside for a potentially open c-file opens new avenues for pressure. Bringing the rook to the central file signals a desire to challenge white's queenside expansion and prepare for potential breakthroughs. Pushing forward this pawn immediately sacrifices space and opens new attacking avenues for black's pieces near the king. Preparing to challenge the queenside pawn structure. A bold maneuver to activate the rook and potentially open lines. Initiating a dramatic kingside pawn storm, aiming to shatter black's defensive fortress. Restructuring the knight aims to support the kingside assault and prepare for a more active role in the center. Opening the center. This gambit sacrifices a pawn to seize the initiative and disrupt black's pawn structure. Reinforcing the pawn chain. Black aims to solidify their queenside and prepare for potential counterplay. Opening the d-file now unleashes potential attacking lines while simultaneously exposing white's king if black can coordinate effectively. Reclaiming the center with the queen opens up possibilities on the queenside, though it might invite further exchanges. Solidifying the central control with this rook lift aims to prepare a coordinated push on the kingside, exploiting black's somewhat passive piece placement. Reinforcing the bishop's outpost. This maneuver aims to solidify black's queenside presence and potentially prepare for future pawn advances. Liberating the bishop from its blockade finally activates this crucial diagonal. Seeking space and piece activation, the queen shifts to a more central, probing position. Unleashing the d-pawn creates a dynamic central thrust, aiming to shatter black's pawn chain and seize open lines for aggressive activity. A bold recapture that opens up the queen's diagonal, but exposes the king's pawn shield to serious pressure. Reclaiming the open file, white prepares to challenge black's isolated queen's pawn. Unleashing a pawn storm on the queenside opens lines but weakens the b-pawn's defenses. Capturing the pawn opens the queen's diagonal and exploits the exposed black bishop. The rook vacates its original square, aiming to bolster the b-pawn and potentially challenge white's queenside pawns. Seizing the initiative, white liquidates material to disrupt black's pawn structure and open lines. Reclaiming the queen offers a respite, but the structural damage to black's queenside is permanent. Sacrificing the bishop forces a simplification, opening lines for white's rook. Prioritizing king's safety now becomes paramount as the pawn shield crumbles, exposing the monarch to immediate threats. Capturing the rook on a8 immediately simplifies into a winning material advantage for white, albeit at the cost of some pawn structure. Desperate attempt to create counterplay. But the queen is now exposed and the king remains vulnerable. Shifting the bishop to a more active diagonal now pressures the pinned knight and prepares for a potential kingside advance. Sacrificing the rook is a bold attempt to untangle the queenside pawns and activate the king amidst white's structural advantage. Reclaiming the rook secures material and simplifies the board, aiming for a winning material advantage. Capturing the rook provides immediate material gain, but opens black's king to the powerful open files white now commands. Asserting control of the open files is paramount. A desperate attempt to reanimate the position, but the rook's intrusion leads to immediate material loss. Targeting the pawn chain's base. This move aims to fracture black's defense and seize control of the open files that will soon emerge. Unleashing a queen sacrifice to disrupt white's knight superiority and force a liquidation feels like a desperate gambit. Seizing the passed pawn on a simplifies the board and aims to leverage white's material advantage decisively. Reclaiming the queen and re-establishing defensive lines around the monarch is paramount after the recent exchanges. Seeking to solidify black's position. Unlocking the A file for potential infiltration after the bishop sacrifice looks promising.